This story won't leave you unmoved. At 11:42 p.m., Officer Daniel Brooks was parked on Route 17 outside Millhaven, North Carolina. Light traffic, cold air, the kind of shift where nothing usually happens, which is exactly why officers remember nights like this. A gray sedan passed him doing 14 miles over the limit. Not reckless, not drunk looking, just slightly off. He pulled out, lights on. The car responded immediately, slow, controlled, pulled to the shoulder without hesitation. That was the first thing Daniel would later say felt strange. People who are nervous overreact. People hiding something stall. This driver did neither. He approached the window. Middle-aged man, early 40s, clean jacket, hands visible on the wheel. "Evening, officer." Steady voice, not overly friendly, not irritated, just calm. "License and registration." The man handed them over without fumbling. Name on the license, Thomas Reed. Daniel returned to his cruiser, ran the ID. The radio stayed quiet for 3 seconds. Then the dispatcher spoke again, slower this time. "Unit 12, confirm the name." Thomas Reed, date of birth 1978. Silence again, paper shuffling in the background. Then, officer, the individual under that social security number and driver's license record is deceased." Daniel frowned. "Repeat?" "Thomas Reed died in a residential fire in 2008. Confirmed fatality, dental records, death certificate issued." Daniel looked in his rearview mirror. The man in the gray sedan was sitting exactly as before, hands on the wheel, looking straight ahead, not confused, not panicking, waiting. "This," Daniel would later say in testimony, "was the moment I stopped feeling like I was on a traffic stop and started feeling like I was in the wrong story. Because the man in that car didn't look like someone pretending to be alive. He looked like someone who had always been." Thomas Reed did not run. He did not argue. He did not say the police had made a mistake. When Daniel approached the car again, his hand resting near his holster, Thomas simply turned his head. "Is there a problem?" "Yes," said Daniel carefully. "Step out of the vehicle." Thomas complied. No shaking hands, no questions, no defensive energy. At the station, fingerprint scans confirmed something that made the room go quiet. The prints matched the DMV file for Thomas Reed, the same file attached to a death certificate. Detective Laura Chen was called in before midnight. She expected fraud, identity theft, possibly a man who had stolen documents from a dead child years ago. That theory lasted exactly 12 minutes.
Because when they questioned him, Thomas didn't hesitate. He named the elementary school he attended, the street he grew up on, his mother's maiden name, the neighbor who used to yell about his dog. All of it matched archived records of the deceased Thomas Reed. Except one thing. The man sitting in the interview room had memories that continued past 2008. Jobs, apartments, tax filings, DMV renewals. A continuous life. "You're saying," Detective Chen said slowly, "that you are Thomas Reed." "Yes." "But Thomas Reed died in a house fire." Thomas blinked once. "No," he said calmly, "I didn't." There was no confusion in his voice, no performance, just quiet certainty. And that was worse. Investigators expected the unraveling to start quickly. It didn't. Thomas lived in Millhaven for 3 years. Same apartment, same landlord, rent always on time. Worked as a junior accountant for a regional supply company. Quiet employee, no HR complaints, brought his own lunch, took smoke breaks even though no one had seen him smoke. His coworkers described him with the same word, forgettable, which in investigations can be more unsettling than suspicious. He filed taxes under that identity, paid utilities, had a gym membership he rarely used, no criminal history, no attempts to access old family assets, no credit fraud, no loans. If this was identity theft, it was the least profitable one anyone had ever seen. Detective Chen visited his apartment. Inside, there were no signs of someone building a fake life. No stacks of documents, no hidden IDs, no alternate names. Just a couch, a TV, a bookshelf. On that shelf were photo albums, printed photos, childhood photos. Him at age 8, him at 10, him at 13. Same face, same eyes. Growing up. Except those years belonged to a boy who had supposedly died. Chen stared at one picture, a birthday cake with the number 12. Date printed on the back. 2 years after the official death. When she asked where he got the photos, Thomas looked confused. They're mine. That was when the case stopped being about fraud and started being about something that shouldn't be possible. 8 years before that night, in a small cul-de-sac on the outskirts of Millhaven, a house fire had claimed the life of a young boy named Thomas Reed. 8 years, and the memory of that night was still sharp in the minds of the few who had witnessed it. The fire department report listed cause as accidental, electrical fault in the attic, and the boy's body was recovered from the collapsed living room. Dental records confirmed the identity. The coroner signed the death certificate.
Friends and neighbors attended the funeral. Flowers, tears, the kind of ritual that marks the end of a life, making sure the community could move on. Except that it hadn't ended. Detective Chen examined archives, cross-referenced every piece of evidence. She found the fire report, the photographs, and even a small video someone had recorded from across the street. Smoke curling from the chimney, the fire trucks arriving, the last glimpses of life disappearing behind flames. All of it matched the public record. All of it confirmed Thomas Reed's death. Yet here he was, sitting calmly across from her, explaining which local diner still served breakfast on Sunday mornings, which lane to avoid on Route 17 to get around morning traffic, which neighbors still had dogs and which ones had moved away. This knowledge could not have come from anyone else. He had lived it. Chen looked through the old school records, class lists, report cards, teacher's notes, all perfectly preserved. The dates aligned with the original Thomas Reed's life until the fire. After that, the man she was interviewing had records of employment and residence that didn't exist in the public or private archives. It was a gap, a phantom timeline. 8 years of life completely invisible. Yet all the behavior, documents, and filings appeared entirely legal. Taxes filed, rent paid, utility bills settled, credit cards active but unused. Nothing suspicious, and yet completely impossible. Interviews with neighbors who had known the original Thomas confirmed the boy had indeed died. They remembered the fire, the funeral, even the charity drives in his memory. But they also remembered something else. A rumor, a strange adoption process that had happened years before. One of the neighbors had whispered, almost as if afraid someone could hear. I always wondered if that wasn't really him in the house that night. Chen took notes meticulously. She had encountered anomalies before, but nothing like this. Identity thefts? Sure, those happen daily. Fraud, scams, even elaborate schemes that required years of preparation, but they were motivated by profit. This was clean. Perfectly clean. He didn't steal. He didn't lie about loans. He wasn't trying to disappear. He wasn't attempting to rewrite history for advantage. He simply existed. Legally, socially, financially. In every way except biologically, according to official records, he should not have existed. Chen asked him again about the fire. What happened to you that night? She said quietly. Thomas's hands rested calmly on the table. I don't know, he said. I was a child.
I remember smoke, panic, screaming, then darkness. That's all I remember. And that, Chen realized, was the core of the paradox. Somewhere between the fire and the life he had led since, the world had accepted his existence without question. The documents, the filings, the work, the taxes, they all added up. But when it came to the official record, he was a ghost. This realization shifted the investigation from a question of crime to a question of history, law, and identity. Who had created these records? Why? And most pressing, what system allowed a boy who was legally dead to grow into a man who could navigate the world unchallenged for years? Chen reviewed old photographs of Thomas's parents, relatives, and neighbors.
They all confirmed the child died. There was no dispute. The death certificate was signed by multiple authorities. The coroner had personally identified the body. Yet here was a man who answered to that name, who had filled out every form, paid every bill, and interacted with society as if nothing had ever happened. The contradictions multiplied with every interview. Landlords confirmed rental agreements, employers confirmed employment, neighbors recalled interactions. Everything in the man's life checked out, and yet, scientifically, legally, he could not exist. Chen leaned back in her chair and stared at the surveillance photographs from the DMV. They showed a boy, then a burned house, then nothing, until 8 years later when the gray sedan passed the officer on the highway. The air in the room felt impossibly heavy. This wasn't a criminal investigation. It was a case that challenged the very framework of identity and memory. And the detective realized, with a chill, that the more she investigated, the less certain she became about what the world considered real. Thomas Reed woke up the next morning in his small apartment above a corner laundromat. Sunlight crept across the beige carpet, slicing through the blinds in neat lines. He brewed coffee, black, no sugar, no cream. He checked the mailbox, paid bills online, and read the news headlines, the routine of a man who had learned to live quietly. Outside, the street hummed with cars and the occasional dog barking. Nothing remarkable, nothing out of place. Detective Chen had expected confusion, panic, maybe denial. Instead, she found a man whose life operated with the precision of clockwork. He remembered birthdays, anniversaries, co-workers' quirks. He could describe the layout of the local grocery store from memory, and even recalled the exact date a neighbor had planted tulips in her front yard. It was mundane.
And that was terrifying. Investigators interviewed his co-workers. They described Thomas as polite, dependable, unobtrusive. He kept to himself, attended staff meetings without comment, laughed when appropriate, never argued. His work files were impeccable, meticulously organized, devoid of errors. No one had ever seen him cheat, lie, or manipulate a system. Not once. Detective Chen thought about the anomaly. She had dealt with identity theft, imposters, forged documents, but Thomas Reed's life didn't match any of those patterns. He didn't need to forge anything. Everything, the lease, bank account, employment records, tax filings, existed legally, officially, authentically. Yet none of it belonged to the Thomas Reed the world had recorded as dead. She asked him about his social interactions. Did he know the family of the boy who died in the fire? Did he reach out to anyone who had known the original Thomas? No, he said. I don't think anyone from that life is still here. I mean, the people I remember, they're gone now. I just live. Chen realized the dissonance. The man wasn't pretending. He wasn't lying. He wasn't exploiting anyone. He simply existed in a parallel reality, obeying the rules of society while remaining invisible to its records. That's why he had survived undetected for 3 years. She walked through his apartment again, observing details that made her uneasy. His furniture was minimal: a couch, a chair, a small dining table, a bookshelf with a few novels, mostly fiction. On the counter, a photo frame of a younger man holding a cat. No identification paper scattered, no stacks of documents. Just a normal life. The kind of life a person might consider boring, but it was perfect in its ordinariness. She asked about friends. He had a few acquaintances at work, sometimes met for lunch or coffee, nothing deep. He had neighbors he nodded to in the hall. He rarely went to social events, though he attended a local library book club occasionally. He laughed at jokes politely. He commented on weather and traffic. Every behavior normal, every choice carefully mundane. For the first time, Chen considered a terrifying idea. Maybe the anomaly wasn't in his behavior. Maybe the anomaly was the world itself, a system that had failed to account for a human life entirely. She reviewed his banking history, payments for rent, utilities, groceries, coffee, occasional takeout. No anomalies, no attempts to assume anyone else's identity for gain. His credit history showed no increase beyond his own account.
His online activity was typical. Work emails, government forms, shopping receipts, library reservations. Chen asked, "Have you ever considered that your identity is different? That your life might not be what it appears?" Thomas smiled faintly, almost ruefully. "I've wondered, sometimes, but it doesn't change the day-to-day. I still wake up, I still eat, I still work. Everything else doesn't matter until someone notices." That was the moment she understood why he had gone unnoticed. People had never looked. They had assumed.
They had trusted the system. They had believed the records. And in that blind faith, a man who legally didn't exist had been able to live openly, quietly, perfectly ordinary. Chen's report began to take shape. Here was the paradox. All the elements of an ordinary life were present, and yet none of it was real in the eyes of history. The system was perfect, but only because it ignored a truth it could not recognize. She documented everything: the apartment, the routines, the employment, the financial records. Every detail aligned. Every behavior was consistent with a man who had not fabricated a single thing. Every deviation from expectation, his very existence, was invisible until someone actually looked. In that mundane perfection lay the terror. Not danger from action, not threat from malice, not motive for crime. The danger was existence itself. A life that should not be, and yet was. A man moving through the world untouched by suspicion, untouched by law, untouched by history. Chen leaned back, reviewing the timeline. The gray sedan, the traffic stop, the verification of his death. 8 years of unnoticed, unsuspicious life. It was enough to make her question everything she thought she knew about identity, documentation, and trust. Thomas continued with his routine as if nothing had happened. Brewed coffee, paid bills, walked to the laundromat, read newspapers. Unremarkable, perfectly unremarkable. The very normalcy was what made it impossible to believe. And Chen understood. The story she had stumbled upon was not one of crime in the traditional sense. It was a study of reality, a glimpse into what happens when systems fail to recognize life itself. Detective Chen began tracing the timeline backward, past the night of the traffic stop, past the apartment, past even the first employment records. She dug into public archives, old school records, hospital birth certificates, census data. Everything matched perfectly, until it didn't. There were gaps, small, almost imperceptible gaps, like erasures in a notebook, missing signatures, dates that didn't align.
Birth certificates issued for Thomas Reed as a child existed, yes, but some were duplicates, others were amended. Records from the fire incident had one anomaly. A clerk's signature didn't match others in the same batch, a small detail, easy to overlook. Yet it was enough to make a trained investigator pause. Chen started interviewing neighbors from the Reed cul-de-sac. Most remembered the fire. They remembered the boy. They remembered the panic. But a few recalled rumors, hushed conversations that had been dismissed as gossip. I don't know, he didn't die there, one elderly neighbor said. I swear I saw him months later, or someone very much like him. The memory was vague, almost imperceptible, but Chen documented it. Multiple accounts converged in small ways, glimpses of a boy matching Thomas's description, in places he shouldn't have been, in another town, on another street. Each account independently plausible, together impossible. Chen examined the adoption and foster care records. Here she found a pattern. Children had been moved between small, often private agencies. Names changed, records merged, lost in filing errors, or perhaps intentionally erased. Some of the forms were never digitized. Others had signatures that didn't match any known clerk. It suggested a system willing to bend rules, or perhaps a deliberate erasure of a child from one life into another. She realized the magnitude. Thomas had not simply survived a fire. His existence had been actively reconstituted. Someone had manipulated records, transferred documents, created continuity, not for profit, not for malice, but for control, to hide, to obscure. Interviews with social workers who had worked in the region during that time revealed another layer. Several remembered cases of children being quietly removed, moved between guardians, adopted without clear documentation. A few mentioned private arrangements with parents who were cooperative but insisted on anonymity. Files had been labeled internal use only and sealed. Thomas's name appeared in one such file, then disappeared, then reappeared years later under a different guardian. Chen felt the story shifting. This was not a crime of one man. It was a system, a small network of people able to erase a child's legal history, then reintroduce him seamlessly into society. She returned to Thomas's apartment to observe. The man moved through his life as if nothing had happened. Coffee, bills, walks, grocery shopping, occasional visits to the library. He lived an ordinary life, meticulously ordinary. Yet every detail she verified told a story that should not exist.
DNA analysis offered another clue. Swabs taken from his belongings matched his fingerprints on documents, verifying the authenticity of every record he touched. Yet they also revealed traces of people who had handled him before the fire: caretakers, hospital staff, foster guardians. The patterns suggested a continuity of contact with adults who had vanished from records. It was subtle, nearly invisible, but it confirmed her suspicion. Thomas had been passed along, monitored, managed, not abused, not neglected, just moved. Chen reconstructed the timeline. Fire in 2008, emergency response, recovery of a body, funeral, public record confirmed death. Months later, a child matching his description was seen with a foster family in a neighboring county. Over the years, employment records, rental agreements, tax filings created a continuous life. Yet official death records never corrected, never reconciled. He had, somehow, existed entirely legally and yet not legally at all. Thomas was not hiding. He had not fabricated identity. He had been quietly inserted into the world as a living anomaly. When Chen asked him about the foster system, he shook his head. "I don't remember much. Faces, places, rules, but not dates, not paperwork. I just adapted." That adaptation had been perfect. No fingerprints on the wrong documents, no mismatched signatures, no anomalies that would trigger suspicion. He had moved through life unseen by the very institutions meant to track him. The detective realized something else. The system had not merely failed, it had been complicit. Bureaucrats, social workers, clerks, intentionally or by neglect, had preserved the illusion. Each layer of oversight reinforced the next. And when Thomas emerged as an adult, all of the rules still applied. He had a life, a legal existence, a world of documents proving who he was, and yet, according to history, he shouldn't exist at all. Chen sat back. She thought about the implications. Not fraud, not crime in the traditional sense. A man alive in a world that declared him dead, a past erased, and a present unchallenged. It was a story without precedent, a puzzle of reality itself, and every step forward only deepened the mystery, raising a question that would haunt her. If a life can be erased and restored with such precision, what else could exist outside of what we consider possible? Thomas Reed sat in his apartment, staring at the calendar on the wall. Days marked off, routines noted, bills tracked. Ordinary life. Yet for the first time, he felt its fragility. Something had shifted.
The night of the traffic stop, the police scanner call, Detective Chen's questions, everything had unsettled him. He had lived quietly for years, thinking existence itself was enough. Now it felt like the world had noticed him. He thought of the fire, the smoke, the panic, the darkness. He remembered crawling through the house, the heat, the smell of charred wood. He had not thought of it for years, not consciously. But now the memory burned brighter, sharper. Who had moved him? Who had orchestrated the seamless erasure of a child from history? The documents, the adoption files, the guardians, all coordinated. The precision required was immense, and he had been the product, not a conspirator, not a victim in the conventional sense, but a managed anomaly. He opened a drawer and pulled out a photo album, pictures of himself as a boy, with people he could not name, hands that held him, smiles that belonged to strangers, streets he did not recognize. The timeline was fractured, yet somehow linear. Each photograph reinforced a question he could not answer. How had he survived a death everyone recorded as final? Detective Chen walked into the apartment again, quietly. She did not knock. Thomas did not flinch. The tension between them was not anger, nor fear. It was recognition. Two people standing on the edge of reality, trying to reconcile the impossible. "You understand," Chen said, "that nothing about this is supposed to exist." Thomas nodded slowly. I know, but it's all I've ever known." Chen explained what she had discovered, the duplications in school and foster records, the small anomalies in clerical signatures, the gaps in the adoption system. She described the DNA traces, the continuity of interactions with adults who no longer existed in the system, the precision of his legal life, despite historical death. Thomas listened quietly, absorbing the words. He had sensed over the years that he moved through life differently, that his existence was somehow smoother, less noticed. But he had attributed it to luck,
to routine, to his quiet nature. Now he understood it was systemic, deliberate, and beyond comprehension. "I thought I was just lucky," he said finally, "or unnoticed. But this is different. Someone planned it, or at least someone allowed it." Chen realized something. Thomas's calm was not indifference, it was survival. A man who had learned to exist in the gaps of reality, to navigate between the cracks where the world's records failed, where memory faltered, where bureaucracy faltered. He had adapted instinctively, perfectly. Together, they reconstructed the timeline once more. 8 years of life hidden within normalcy. Birth certificates, school records, tax filings, rental agreements, employment contracts, all aligning.
Yet the death certificate remained official, authoritative, unquestioned. Thomas existed in contradiction. He was both present and absent, alive and legally dead. The realization settled into Thomas like a weight. Every interaction, every routine, every smile he had shared with friends and coworkers now carried a shadow. People had trusted his existence. The system had validated it, but history had denied it. And somewhere, in the quiet corners of bureaucracy, someone had silently orchestrated this anomaly, or at least permitted it. For Detective Chen, the stakes changed. This was no longer a question of identity theft, fraud, or even impersonation. This was a question of the human capacity to exist unnoticed, of systems that could fail spectacularly without anyone realizing. Every assumption she had held about verification, legality, and continuity shattered. The psychological tension mounted. Thomas felt the scrutiny not as accusation, but as illumination. Every action he had taken, every day he had lived, was now visible in a new light. And yet, there was no crime to confess, no deceit to explain, only existence. That night, Thomas walked the streets of Millhaven, alone. Streetlights painted the asphalt in pale yellows, leaves rustled underfoot, ordinary houses lined quiet roads, and yet, for the first time, he felt the weight of history pressing against him. He moved like a ghost in a world that had always ignored him, until now. That evening, Thomas walked again to the bridge overlooking the creek. Wind stirred the leaves, water rippled below. He understood now that his existence was a careful balance. One misstep, one deviation, and the fragile framework that allowed him to live could collapse. He felt the weight of this truth as deeply as he had felt the smoke and heat of the fire years ago. Chen followed at a distance, observing without intervening. She noted his routines, his pauses, his expressions. The psychological tension was palpable, a man aware that his life was extraordinary, yet outwardly ordinary, navigating a world that had neither recognized nor understood him. That night, Thomas wrote in a small notebook, not dates, not appointments, not mundane tasks, but reflections, thoughts about existence, about observation, about the forces that had guided him through years of legal and social invisibility. He wrote of gratitude, confusion, awe, and fear. Each word carried weight, each reflection an attempt to reconcile a life that should not have been possible.
Chen's report, submitted to her superiors, concluded with a summary that straddled disbelief and fact. Thomas Reed's life had been maintained with precision, legality, and invisibility. The system, whether by design or accident, had preserved him. Yet the investigation could not explain fully how or why. It was a case beyond precedent, beyond expectation, beyond the ordinary boundaries of understanding. Thomas returned home that night, calm in demeanor, but conscious of the fragile balance of his existence. The ordinary streets of Millhaven, the routine interactions, the daily rituals, all carried new weight. Every detail mattered now. Every observation, every record, every routine could reveal him, expose him, change everything. Chen closed her files. She realized that the story of Thomas Reed was not about crime, not about guilt or punishment. It was about survival, observation, and the spaces where human systems fail. A man had lived 8 years in plain sight, legally invisible, and the world had accepted it, unknowingly complicit in preserving a life that should have vanished. The tension lingered long after the files were closed. Thomas Reed remained ordinary, yet extraordinary, existing, breathing, moving in a world that denied him reality, yet depended on him for nothing. A life curated by forces unseen, observed only by those who dared to look closer.
And in that tension, Chen understood the unspoken truth. Some lives exist not to be explained, but to remind the world that reality is stranger, more fragile, and more extraordinary than any record, document, or law can capture. Detective Chen monitored his movements from a distance. She did not follow, did not intervene. She only watched, taking note of patterns, timing, and routine. A life so ordinary that it became extraordinary. In the quiet of the evening, Thomas paused at a small bridge overlooking a creek. He leaned on the railing, feeling the wind, listening to water rushing over rocks. He realized something profound. The world had allowed him to live, but the truth of his existence was fragile. One misstep, one exposure, one deviation, and the system could erase him again. This tension, the detective noted later in her report, was the defining characteristic of Thomas Reed. Not danger, not malice, not even deception, but vulnerability. A man living openly, legally, and completely unaccounted for by history. By the end of that night, both Thomas and Chen understood the same truth. This story was not about crime.
It was about survival, about adaptation, about the spaces where reality bends and the human mind accepts contradictions. It was about a life that should not have existed, and yet did. The following morning, Detective Chen returned to the archives, determined to connect every remaining thread. Every file, every signature, every photograph had to be reconciled. It was meticulous work, painstaking. Yet with each cross-reference, the story sharpened. Patterns emerged, subtle, almost imperceptible, but undeniable. Thomas Reed's life had been guided, monitored, and protected in a way no ordinary person could have anticipated. She laid out the timeline on her office wall: the fire in 2008, the missing months, the duplicate records, the carefully orchestrated adoption transitions, the seamless integration into society. Every anomaly that had once seemed random now aligned with intent. Someone, or some system, had ensured he could not only survive, but thrive unnoticed. Chen realized the precision was almost surgical. Not one document contradicted another. Not one action deviated from ordinary expectation. Thomas had been allowed a life so perfectly ordinary that the world never questioned him. Meanwhile, Thomas sat at his kitchen table, coffee in hand, staring at the sunlight streaming through the blinds. He had sensed the shift in Chen's investigation, felt the tension, understood that something extraordinary had been uncovered, and now, seeing the timeline she laid out, he faced it himself. He could trace the steps, reconstruct the interventions, imagine the hands that guided him, the decisions that kept him safe, invisible. He had lived years without question, without doubt, and now the certainty of observation pressed on him like gravity. "I always thought life was just routine," he said softly, almost to himself. "Wake up, work, eat, sleep, repeat. I never realized someone else might have been orchestrating the repeats for me." Chen nodded silently, taking notes. She didn't speak. There was nothing to say that could bridge the gap between what was real and what was unseen. The tension in the room was not accusation, it was recognition. Recognition of the extraordinary, hidden beneath the mundane. The life of Thomas Reed was normal only because it had been curated. Every mundane interaction, every small choice, every day-to-day action had been permitted by forces invisible, yet unmistakably deliberate. Outside, Millhaven moved as usual. Children walked to school, cars hummed along familiar streets. Shops opened, employees clocked in, neighbors exchanged greetings. And yet, one man's life carried the weight of secrets the world could not comprehend. Chen returned to her desk and compiled a detailed report. She documented every anomaly, every interaction, every trace of intervention. But she also noted what no report could convey: the psychological reality of existing in the gaps of history. Thomas Reed was not just a man legally visible. He was a man whose entire perception of life had been shaped by forces beyond understanding.